Thank you very much, Fuande, for that word of welcome. I also want to welcome all of us to this final day of the event 2025, the first session for that matter, and for me, the most exciting of sessions. Our session today is entitled The Tide That Binds, Horror, Trauma, Memory, and Rewilding. As you can see, it's a session that invites some reflections from a multi or interdisciplinary perspective. And to help us channel the conversations, we have panelists, Itamar Vieira, who was supposed to be with us physically, but who for good reason is unable to join us, but we are hoping to have him with us via video link. We have Karen Lord, who is with us today. We also have Javier, Ortiz, and my immediate left, Ilija. We also have two interpreters to help us scale the walls of incomprehension, because some of our panelists speakers of Portuguese and speakers of Spanish, and the two languages are not particularly common in this part of the world. So we have secured some assistance to help us converse intelligently. Now, given the circumstances, I think I'm not the best place to introduce our speakers. I would want to pass on the responsibility to each one of them to tell us who they are, what they are working on, and then from that point we'll proceed with the conversations. As we have been doing, my thinking is that once we have the introductions, we'll make some few remarks about the overarching concerns of horror, trauma, of memory, and how all these help, or rather how all these underpin the artistic outputs of our panelists. And then subsequently, we'll have a few questions directed to each one of our panelists from the moderator's standpoint. And then subsequently, we'll open up the session for a Q&A from the plenary. And then we'll hope that by the end of that, we should have deepened a bit of our understanding about the tide that binds all of us in these global encounters. So without wasting much time, let me invite our panelists. I think the best would be to start with my immediate left, Ilija, to take us through his own introduction, and then we'll move on from that point and then see. Welcome.
Please, you start.
Okay, my name is Karen Lord. I'm from Barbados. I write primarily science fiction and fantasy, but sometimes in these literary spaces, I'm not quick to say that because there are people who don't realize you can have literary science fiction and fantasy. You will be able to see my first book, Redemption in Indigo, which is based on a folktale at the bookstore outside. But more recently, connected to the sea, I did in fact write a book called The Blue Beautiful World. It got longlisted for the Women's Prize. That was published in 2023. And that is about, that definitely looks at the question of whether we might have intelligences in the ocean, the deep ocean, and what that might mean for aliens who come to see whether they can connect with Earthlings, but humans are not necessarily the ones that they're first looking for. I can't think of anything else to add, so I will now pass back to Ilija.
Good morning. I actually have a surname, which is Trojanow, so my name is Ilija Trojanow. I guess the most important thing about me is that 45 years ago, I learned to play the guitar over there. I'm of Bulgarian origin, refugee, grew up in Kenya, have lived all over the world, have written many books, but that's on the internet. And I pass on to my colleague.
Yo soy Javier Ortiz Cassiani, soy de formación historiador, pero los historiadores ya no me quieren porque renuncié un poco al estudio de la historia académica y me fui más por el lado de la crónica, del ensayo, del relato, de la memoria. No.
My name is Javier Ortiz Cassiani. I am a historian, but nowadays historians don't like me much because I went more into the chronicles and stories instead of the academic approach to history.
Nací en Valledupar, en el Caribe colombiano, pero he vivido la mayor parte del tiempo en Cartagena de Indias, también en el Caribe colombiano. Cartagena de Indias, para resumirla, es la ciudad, el puerto que más, en algún momento de la historia, que más personas sacadas de África recibió en el territorio de América.
I am originary of Valledupar, of the Colombian Caribbean, but most of my life I lived in Cartagena, also in the Colombian Caribbean. Cartagena was once the biggest port on earth that received the most African descendant people to the Americas. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, I think you can hear me. Thank you. I think the best then would be for us to proceed. And I want to begin by inviting Karen to tell us something about how she envisages, the folk tales, the folk narrative, which she places central in her writing as an important aspect of collective memory. Because I think one of the things that affects a lot of communities in the Caribbean generally is the idea of how they remember the past and the nature of that past, which quite often is contained in the folk narratives that travel, by word of mouth and by print to the rest of the world.
Thank you. That's a very interesting question. And I do, in fact, have to say that I was speaking to Nalo Hopkinson. This is a Canadian writer, but originally from Jamaica, who writes Caribbean speculative fiction as well. And we were discussing how, in many ways, the trauma that we can't process, the trauma that we can't speak about, turns up in folklore. Now, I don't have some sort of front and center examples from my own literature, so I want to fall back on some colleagues. And the two titles I'm thinking about are The Mermaid of Black Conch by Monique Rafi, who is a Trinidadian writer. I believe I have that right, yes. And that is actually the titular mermaid in the story is actually someone of indigenous origin, Taino origin, who has been cursed in some way and ends up in more contemporary times. And that's an interesting thing because the trauma that we have in the region is not just a trauma of those who came in the Middle Passage, it's also the trauma of the genocide of those who were there. And there are ways in which some countries still have the presence of indigenous people, and then other countries where the indigenous are more of a memory themselves, more part of the language, maybe a few customs, maybe some food and so forth. But as an actual active present group, they're not necessarily in those countries. So that's one very interesting book because of the presence of the mermaid as a creature of the sea, but also as a sort of an indication of the past that you must not forget. And the other book is called Josephine Against the Sea by Shakira Bourne, who is a Barbadian writer, writes for young people, so kind of like young teens and so on. And again, we have a sort of a spirit from the sea, a kind of a what we would call a mami water kind of spirit, but who has disguised herself as someone who is, how to put this, her fisherman father brings back this woman who is sort of angling to be the new stepmother. and she is the one who recognizes this is not a human being. This is not someone normal. And this is an interesting story where on the one hand people are like, oh, you're not able to get over the death of your mother and you can't accept a replacement and this is what the issue is. And she's like, no, the issue is this is someone who is not human. And there's still an interesting element of, yes, there is grief and trauma wrapped up in the presence of this woman who is not human, who's coming to as an interloper into the family. So I've actually been fascinated by how they took those particular folklore elements and made the real life more vivid by having them portray elements of grief, elements of trauma in people's lives, both the past and in the present.
Thank you, because it seems then from what you're saying that the whole idea of trauma is tied very closely to personal histories or social histories that unfold as a matter of every day.
This is it. I think that anytime we're engaging with literature, there's both the personal things and the present things we're experiencing, but also how they connect to the past, also how they echo the past, also how they are in a way the unresolved past. Some people talk about the echoes of the ancestors' trauma and how you live your lives presently, and I think that's very true.
And I think at this point, then, this ties in quite closely with what Javier said by way of personal introduction, especially the idea that there's something both very personal about history, but also something very local. And in his self-introduction, he talked about veering off from mainstream historical methods to do chronicles and personal narratives. I don't know if that comment on that. Yeah. I'm asking, how does his own trajectory as a historian, who is not a mainstream historian, tie in with the idea of folkways as a way of dealing with trauma, with memory?
Bueno, lo primero que tendría que decir es que quizás me voy a al ensayo, a la crónica, a la memoria, al relato, porque no creo en la objetividad.
The first thing to say is that I precisely go to the chronicle and to this approach to histories because I don't really believe on objectivity.
Y la historia académica en la que me formaron siempre está pensando en la idea de la distancia, ¿no? Del objeto de estudio, la distancia con la fuente para escribir sobre sujetos que han sido víctimas.
And precisely the issue that I see to this approach to history is that academic history has a distance from the subject that is studying about and the non-involvement on the study of this subject.
Lo que yo trato de poner allí es todo lo contrario, toda la subjetividad para tratar de comprender mejor a estos sujetos que han sido víctimas o que han sufrido el trauma, en este caso de la diáspora, de la esclavización.
What I try to do through my work is the opposite. I try to work through a subjective approach and through that way comprehend better the subject that I'm studying, and precisely that's the way that I approach trauma in my work.
Pero tengo que ser lo suficientemente cuidadoso para que la memoria de estos sujetos que me interesa historiar no sea solo de su condición de víctimas.
And I have to be very careful to approach this way of approaching to memory, since it's not a matter of only caring about the pain. It's don't focus only on the trauma itself.
La esclavización básicamente lo que hace es deshumanizar, y la búsqueda de estos sujetos es la recuperación de la humanidad.
Slavery, what it does is to dehumanize and
La esclavización deshumaniza, y lo que hacen los sujetos esclavizados es buscar recuperar la humanidad.
slavery dehumanize, and what subjects try to do, what slaves would aim to reclaim is precisely this dignity and outspoken position.
Porque es muy fácil y también deshumanizador mirar con condescendencia a estos sujetos como pobrecitos, fueron esclavizados o descienden de esclavizados, y se olvida la condición humana con sus virtudes, defectos, habilidades.
It's because it's very easy to just approach slavery or slaves as victims, and precisely what would be the other approach is to approach their dignity as itself, and not only through this condescendence.
Y en ese sentido tampoco tengo temor de meterme dentro de la historia. Si estoy estudiando a un poeta del siglo XIX afrocolombiano como Candelario Obeso, si estoy escribiendo un relato sobre Candelario Obeso, no tengo ningún problema en preguntarme si cuando yo era un niño a Candelario Obeso se leía en el colegio, en la institución educativa donde yo estudiaba.
And that's why I don't fear to approach the story in this way. And for example, if I want to refer as an author as Candelario Beso, I have no problem to approach to it, asking myself if I read, or in my institution we read about Candelario Beso and his history.
Thank you. And I think for me, the critical point is the idea that there's something very subjective about the discipline of history, that history is not an objective discipline. The idea that you are writing is supposed to restore the dignity of descendants of slavery. Ties in quite closely with her own writing, which more or less does the same thing, especially in view of what narratives the sea and other water masses generate. And I think that there's something essentially human in the restorative power of stories. So at this point, I want to invite Ilija to reflect with us how his own experiences with stories and storytelling and writing, especially based on his own experiences as somebody who's traveled everywhere, as a former refugee or something like that, how then these stories tie with what Karen and what Javier have said.
Well, let me return to the title, The Tide That Binds, and to the beautiful word reworlding. Stories travel both in time and geographically. To give you an example, a few years back, I was on a panel with Abdelrazak Gurna, who's from Zanzibar. We found out that we actually grew up with the same stories, for the very simple reason that there's a character called Nasruddin Hoxha in the Islamic world, who is very well known in Bulgaria, where I come from. But in Arabic, the name is Juha, and he was one of the main characters that, as both a trickster, a storyteller, a provocateur, he was in many of the stories that people along the East African coast grew up with. So stories travel in the bags of donkeys across the Silk Route. They travel on dhows across the Indian Ocean. Stories are part of the forces and the energies of confluence, which actually bind the dynamic forces of culture. Because I think one of the mistakes we tend to make, because many people tend to look at the reality of storytelling within the confines of one language, one nation, one ideology, we forget that stories are actually what breaks open these categories and these confines. Second example is that many of the stories that defined the emergence of European storytelling came from Asia. And there's a direct link between ancient Sanskrit texts, that Panchatantra, for example, that traveled across, that traveled west, came into the Persian literature, were refashioned, reworded, and reworlded, then went across through the Arab traders. They went all the way to Spain, to Al-Andalus, and then, just to give you one example, there was one man called Alfonsi, Petrus Alfonsi, who was actually the doctor in Granada of the vizier. So he traveled then to London, and this is how the stories entered the storytelling lines of the early English language, and they enter the works of Shakespeare, for example. The framework, the way stories are framed, so you have a frame that binds them together, comes also from Sanskrit, Persian, Arabic, into Decameron by Boccaccio, and defines actually storytelling as a modern craft. So I think it's very important to not only underline how stories heal, what both my colleagues said, but also how stories bind us, because they're an open invitation for people to personally or as a social group engage in, to retell the story by making it their own story. And I think the best example is India, where you have epics that are 2,000, 3,000 years old, that are continuously retold by different groups within India. So the so-called untouchables, the better name is Dalit, would use these old sacred texts, but redefine them by making them emancipatory, subversive narratives that put a Dalit into the center of the narrative. In modern times, women authors would change around, would suddenly make the subdued woman in an old tale from Mahabharata or for the Ramayana a self-defined, powerful woman at the center of the narrative. So I think we have the tide, for me, represents the geographical coming together, the confluences, and the reworlding represents the fact that there is some kind of a foundational storytelling background that we share and that feeds us, but without predefining the outcome. It just gives us a kind of instrument, and it gives us an alphabet of storytelling that we can put together time every generation and every author time and again.
Can I respond to what Ilija said, because it's fantastic? I want to address the traveling of stories, the retelling of stories, the reworlding of stories. The same Shakira Bourne, recently we had a big regional festival called Carifesta in Barbados, and I attended a lecture of hers. She's done some deep research into Anansi stories, which originated in West Africa and came over. And then in the Caribbean, we're retelling those stories, and we're changing them. We're adding things to them. So she did some research, way back into from when they were told during the pre-emancipation days and up to the present, and you could see where additional trauma was in the stories and being dealt with, families being killed and all sort of thing. And then you can also see how they changed as became more modern. And one of the things that she did as a result of this research, the point of the research was that she was going to write a modern day anthology of Anansi stories for school children. And she made sure to put in, yes, some folk songs from before, but she also put in like some of the chants that we sing at school sports. So there's like the new stuff is coming, and the new stuff is now being incorporated into those old frameworks. So it's very much like you said, the stories are traveling, the stories are connected. I mean, there's still enough of a connection between what is still told in West Africa and what we're telling now, but we're always making it evolve. We're always adding what's new. We're always demonstrating within the story what new things we've created and want to express to the world.
And just one sentence to add to that, one of the beautiful things about the trickster figure, which actually exists in nearly every culture in the world, is that it gives us and it gives every one of us the chance to engage in a kind of rebellion through storytelling. It challenges authority, it challenges ideology, it challenges dogma, but it is a storytelling principle and a technique that is well established. And that is, I think, the beauty of it.
Precisely so, and that's what she found with the more traumatic stories. It was definitely Anansi as a figure of rebellion for those who were not in a position to rebel themselves.
Yeah, thank you. And I think, coming from what both of you have just shared now, it is an allusion to the fact that the past is never entirely past, that it lives with us. And sometimes some of the routine encounters actually signal a very deep historical facts. I mean, Ilija mentioned Spain, and it reminded me that the whole story about, the trauma of the Atlantic has been recreated in the recent past through the trauma of the Mediterranean, people trying to escape all sorts of hardships across the Mediterranean. A number of them now live in those aquatic graves, which is something really, really sad. I don't know if there's something that the three of you could very quickly comment on, starting with Javier, that the idea of, historical trauma manifests itself in new versions in the present times. And that a lot of, the things that we write about, the things that we read about, you see the transoceanic travels, the unfortunate loss of lives, the indignifying experiences and so on, are not things of the past as such, but that they are variants of the same that continue to unfold in the present times.
Bueno, la idea de la conexión de las historias es una manera también de acabar con la idea de que la vida funciona por etapas y que ocurre una cosa y luego viene otra que se distancia de la que ocurrió anteriormente.
The idea that there's a connection between stories is a different approach, that life comes through different stages, that of this original idea that each time it's a different stage apart from the beginning.
en los últimos tiempos se ha optado, o algunos han optado por no narrar el trauma, porque consideran que el hecho, el horror genera o revictimiza, ¿no? Convierte en víctimas a los descendientes de los que fueron víctimas.
In the last time, there are some authors that don't refer to the trauma because that revictimizes some of the populations that yes.
Pero yo no estoy de acuerdo con eso porque el trauma hay que narrarlo. Lo que hay que hacer es que además del trauma, además del hecho traumático, hay que narrar los otros hechos que ocurren, que le ocurren a esta gente, las otras cosas que hacen esta gente.
I don't agree with this approach that doesn't treats trauma. What I think personally is that trauma has to be narrated, but has also to be, but other elements of this history have also to be treated. The histories precisely of these persons have also to be described.
Por ejemplo, el caso de muchas de las manifestaciones culturales que definen la identidad de muchas de las naciones en América Latina y el Caribe son manifestaciones culturales producidas por la población que sufrió el trauma.
For example, the cultural manifests on the Caribbean region are manifestations that treat precisely this trauma.
Es decir, lo que hay que narrar entonces es lo importante que es que pese al hecho traumático, ¿no? Pese a la opresión, pese a las condiciones de desventaja, esta gente fue capaz de construir los referentes culturales que definen la identidad de esos territorios.
What has to be narrated is, nevertheless, those difficult conditions, nevertheless, those unbalanced situations that these populations that had the trauma, they nevertheless, they were able to build an identity and self-narrative.
Si me quedo solo en el hecho traumático, estaría contando solo una pequeña parte de la historia de estos sujetos y le estaría quitando el valor que tienen en la construcción o en el desarrollo de una sociedad.
If I just stick to the trauma and narrate history only centering on the trauma, I will ignore the importance of the history and life of these peoples and the way precisely that they build their society and yes, their self-narrative.
Thank you. Ilija?
Yeah, just to add to that, I think trauma writing is writing about echoes, and it's very different from writing from the perspective of witnesses. And if you take the German tradition, I think, not tradition, the German experience after the Second World War, it's very interesting to see that very often it took 2 generations for the people then to come to terms, to come to literary terms with the horrendous crime and mass murder of the Holocaust. Because the echo through the generations actually sometimes becomes louder and clearer, and all the forms of kind of long-term damage, psychological damage, social infractions and so on, becomes more evident, and a wound that is not healed, of course, festers. So there's a dynamic there that I think is very, very decisive. Also, there are layers of trauma. I was just, as you were speaking, I was thinking of a beautiful book a friend of mine wrote, author from Somalia, Nuruddin Farah, called Yesterday, Tomorrow. And he visits the Somali diaspora around the world. And as you know, there's a big one, refugee diaspora in this country. And he finds out that many of the people, all of them refugees, many of them with horrendous personal stories, have layered traumas. So it's not only their personal trauma, which is then passed on to the to the children, for example, who were born and grew up in Minnesota and in Norway, wherever it might be, but it's also the trauma of a previous war situation, dictatorship, aggression by the Ethiopian army, and so on and so forth. And I think this layered complexity makes writing about trauma so incredibly important, but also so very difficult, because there is no monocausality, there's no simple clarity. It can therefore, and this is the beauty of literature, I think it can therefore be best addressed within what we do, because what is the novel if not the supreme art form of complexity?
What is the novel? One last remark before we open up.
I'm going to conclude then by saying something that is maybe slightly removed, but going back to the whole concept of the sea connecting us. One of the things I wrote about in my most recent book was something that I had read about in terms of not my own region's legends, but legends of the Pacific. So in the story, we have a connection between the people of the islands in that ocean and those who, the intelligences live in the ocean, where those who die and are buried at sea may have their consciousness absorbed by the intelligences in the sea. And this was based on an article I read where there's this group that not only venerated the presence of whales in their waters, but also felt that sometimes the whale was an ancestor come back to help the village and help the community in some way. And I thought it was interesting that there is that beyond humanity idea that we could have a continuing presence, a continuing influence after death by being reborn as some part of the ocean or something in the ocean. And that myth and that legend still connects us to our human identity and the community that produced us.
Thank you. Yeah, that reminds me of the poem by Edward Bauer. You know, something happens in the middle of a story, and the idea is that some of the things that can pass off as superstitions, as acts of belief, are actually gestures that communities invent to honor their relatives who lie in those water bodies. So I think at this point, let me see if we have any questions from the plenary, and I'll request that you direct the question to the panelists that you have in mind, and I will also request that we make it short and sweet. Thank you.
I have two questions, and one is addressed to Ilija and another to Javier. The one I addressed to Ilija is, as writers addressing trauma, you run the risk of turning your work into an incentive to replicate that trauma. How would you address that? And to Javier, how do you make sure, as a writer, in modern society, weakness is weaponized. Weakness is turned into an ideological weapon. How would you address that? Weakness. The fact that we were slaves is used by contemporary, by the modern subject as a political tool, as a political weapon. How would you address that? Thank you.
Mine is to the whole panel, and it ties to the last question by the previous speaker. In regards to trauma and horror, how do you ensure in your writing that this horror and this trauma is not then used as a way of silencing, as a censorship to anybody who might, or the victims of that trauma or the survivors of that trauma?
We can begin by responding to that first set. We'll start with Ilija.
I have difficulties with the word replicating because, as I said, I see it as an echo. So the echo, or you bang a gong and the gong goes on and on. So basically what you're doing is you're dealing with the echo of the gong. You're not replicating. If you don't deal with that, I was just thinking as you were asking the question of a beautiful novel I recently read from a Palestinian author called Shibli, where she describes how in the contemporary young female Palestinian generation, certain undiscussed and unreflected horrors of the Nakba and of 1948 constantly turn up without people even knowing about it. So I think the first thing is through storytelling, you're actually making something that is unseen, that is subconscious, visible. An unheard voice that is just there in the background as a droning of fear maybe and of pain. You're focusing on it. And so I don't see that danger at all, no. I actually think that if you don't deal with the traumas, and I experienced that in India when there were enormous conflicts within the city between different groups, is that undiscussed traumas from the partition were politically instrumentalized by saying we can now kill them because they killed us during the partition, which is 70 or 75 years ago. So I think quite the opposite. I think not dealing with traumas guarantees that violence is repeated.
Hay una idea que se trabaja, que han venido trabajando los sociólogos, antropólogos, que es la idea de las tretas del débil. Las tretas que el débil pone en acción. Tretas, estrategias.
There's one idea that sociologists use nowadays, and is how the weak uses certain strategies.
Es decir, parte de la habilidad que tienen los supuestos sometidos es asumir aparentemente su condición de sometidos y jugar con los elementos que el poder usa para controlar.
One of the strategies that can be used precisely through the weak is how to use those elements used to describe them as an element of defense and support.
Alguna vez revisando los archivos en Cartagena de Indias, me encontré con la historia de una mujer negra, afrodescendiente, en el siglo XVIII, que fue condenada por practicar el contrabando.
Once I researched in the archive of Cartagena, I saw a case of a lady on the 18th century that was judged for illegally import. Contraband, that's the word, contraband.
La acusaron de contrabandear con telas, de vender telas de manera ilegal.
She was judged of using textiles illegally.
Y en la declaración que ella da al tribunal, dice, es que yo soy una negra y como soy negra e ignorante, no sabía que eso era contrabando.
In her declaration to the judge, she said that since she was black and she was ignorant, she didn't knew that this was illegal.
Toda la vida escuchó decir que los negros como ella eran ignorantes, de modo que lo que está haciendo es usar eso que el otro le atribuye para su defensa.
So all her life, she heard that black communities were ignorant. So what she did was precisely use that narrative to defend herself.
Lo que demuestra un entendimiento claro de cuál es la visión que los otros tienen de ellas y cómo usar eso para darle la vuelta y convertirlo en algo a favor y en algo que les sirve para defenderse.
So this is an example of how it can be comprehended, the narrative of the other, of the oppressor, to give it a turnaround to defend herself.
Esa historia me parece a mí tan importante como el grupo de esclavizados que toman las armas, hacen una guerra y se escapan a otro territorio.
That story it also reminds me of the case of slaves that took arms to escape to another place.
Thank you.
I was just going to say she was acting like a trickster figure herself. I'd like to answer your question and kind of riff off a bit there. So, kind of as Ilija said, I think that there are definitely, novelists can have two ways of approaching things. Some things have to be told clearly and as they are. It's a form of truth and reconciliation. You have to be able to say very clearly and explicitly what happened, who did what, and so forth. But there's another approach for novelists to take, and that is to completely separate this from the world we know and the people we know and put it into an invented world. And therefore, you are not bringing your preconceptions of a particular people or of a particular country to read the story. It's there are new names, there are new peoples, and then the events that happen to them may be drawn from history, but you don't immediately see that it is connected to a real life event. So now your emotions, your empathy, your understanding, your connection to that story is in a way fresh, but is also a way of kind of educating yourself beyond your prejudices, beyond the narratives that you would have absorbed from the real life situation. So you separate it a bit and you put it into a new framing so that you're forced to look at it with new eyes.
Thank you. I'm itching to ask them a question, but I'll wait until I get a confirmation that there's none from the plenary. Yes, we have two.
Hello. I'm a bit late, so I really hope I'm not like asking something that was answered. But I was wondering, so I'm from Ecuador, and I'm trying to write a novel about concerning Ecuador and the history of Ecuador. But I always wonder with things like, especially like things like horror and trauma and memory, where Ecuador right now is not in the best place. How do you retell a story where you're no longer living in that country? Like I live here. I haven't lived in Ecuador for a few years. But at the same time, you can't go back to that country and like experience the horror because then your brain is not in a space to write. If that makes sense? Like how do you tell a story when you almost feel like you don't own that story, but you still feel like you want to tell a story because it is your story at the same time? If that makes sense.
How are you researching it?
Well, I mean, I grew up in Ecuador until I was 17, so a lot of it is from my own like lived experience, I guess, and then historical, political situations.
Have you been able to read, say, journals or newspaper articles or interviews from those who were also there, so there's more than one view of that time?
Yeah, I mean, I've spoken a lot to my family. Like, I've interviewed my mom and my grandma. But a lot of it is, I feel like it's current as well. Like, it is kind of happening right now. And it's almost like what you were saying of like, I don't want to replicate the trauma because that's not the point. But like, Ecuador has such complex histories, and like the situation we're living in now is a direct consequence of our histories and our consequences. So I feel like I find it tricky because I'm trying to talk about things that like are happening today, but I'm not really longer living there, and I'm not, you know what I mean? Like I'm kind of already seeing them through like a lens or through like with a distance that I feel, is it too big of a distance to now tell the story?
The depth and breadth of your research will inform what you produce. Even stories that we think are very personal and we were there and we know what happened, sometimes we don't know the full story. Something that happened and we were not present, that's definitely something that we need to research. That's the only approach. And honestly, the story you produce, there may still be someone who comes and says, that's not how it was and how dare you. And you just got to take your knocks.
Just 3 very short thoughts. Number 1, nobody owns stories. Stories are universal. Number 2, distance is often very good for writing. When you're too close, it's actually more difficult to write. And the third thing is that many of the greatest novels in literature were written in exile. So being far away from the place you're writing about is certainly not a disadvantage.
Narrar es volver.
Narrate is to return back.
I think kind of related to what you're already getting at right now in response to her question. You know, there's the concept of before, like history was told by the winners. And now through storytelling in the present day, it gives us an opportunity to broaden the viewpoints that we're able to understand and learn from. But also right now we're in this struggle with truth. As she's saying, what do you think are the key elements of storytelling in modern times that we want to fight to maintain as we go towards like future storytelling, if that makes sense? Is that too convoluted?
It makes sense, but it's a very large question.
Yeah.
And I feel as if it almost requires an hour-long lecture.
Entonces la pregunta es que ¿qué son los elementos de la manera que contamos las historias en este momento moderno? Porque en este momento podemos tener una grande puentes de vistas que no teníamos antes. Entonces, ¿qué son los elementos que debemos luchar para mantener por el futuro del puente de historias?
Bueno, yo parto de una idea, ayer precisamente hablaba de la interpretación, ¿no? Somos observadores, los que narramos, los que historiamos, somos observadores de segundo orden. Observamos lo que otros observaron en su momento. Cuando escribimos usando las fuentes que dicen cómo los que vivieron ese tiempo miraron lo que estaba sucediendo. Entonces es una interpretación de interpretación de interpretación.
So we are always second-hand witnesses. For writing, we use the interpretation of the interpretation. So we researched into always second sources.
Y nada se escribe pensando, todo se escribe desde el presente. Todo se escribe desde las preocupaciones del presente.
Everything is written from the present, from the discussions of the present.
De modo que la posibilidad de preservar es precisamente estar siempre haciéndose preguntas en el presente al pasado. El pasado es una herramienta que está allí que nos sirve para entender esto que está sucediendo.
So the way to preserve, to have the possibility to preserve, is questioning from the present, and questioning from the present what happened in the past. Do it continuously.
El pasado no nos podrá decir nada si no somos capaces de hacerle preguntas desde el presente. Y las preguntas siempre van a estar.
The past itself won't tell us nothing till we ask the correct questions from the present, and doing it time and time again.
Thank you. I think we are at the tail end of the session. And if there's no question, I want to invite Ilija to tell us something brief, and then we'll bring it to a close.
Yeah, but because we spoke about tricksters so often, and we've been listening to music for the last half an hour, I want to tell you one of my favorite trickster stories from Nasruddin Hoxha. So Nasruddin Hoxha is invited to a concert, and it's an incredible virtuoso who plays the instrument like a little magician. And Nasruddin is not impressed. Everybody notices. The host is offended and said, Nasruddin, you don't like the music? He said, ah. Now people are really upset. The host takes the instrument, gives it to Nasruddin and says, show us what you can play. Nasruddin takes it, let's say it's an oud or a kamanchi, and strikes one note, just one note. Ding, ding, ding. Everybody is shocked and says, but Nasruddin, you cannot play. And Nasruddin then says, quite the opposite. I have found the right note. This guy is still looking for it.
Beautiful, yeah. So I think we have found the right note to understand the tie that binds. We know something about trauma, that it echoes across generations. We know that writing from afar, from exile, is perhaps the best way, because sometimes when you are too close, you don't see things clearly. You remember that is, I think that's what the Russian president told Reagan, that when you're too close, you don't see things clearly. And I think if we do not have any other questions, I just want to once again apologize for the absence of Itamar Vieira, whose novel Crooked Plow is a hell of a novel that I invite you to all read to understand the peasant character in the 21st century. And I think if we do not have any other business, I just want to thank you so much for creating time to be here. And on this note, let me hand you over to the stage manager for further directions.
Thank you. Thank you, Godwin, for that wonderful session.